But today we're going to talk about the Salton Sea, and we have a good man here to talk to us about that. Many of us fly around this area, so we know the sea very well. A little background. In 1905, this was long before the Boulder and now Hoover Dam was constructed, which was constructed in 1935. The river was a natural flowing river, and was, of course, it was open to the ravages of weather. And in 1905, they had big storms, and they had a big meltdown off the mountains, and so huge volumes of water came down the Colorado River. And they had started to construct canals running from the river, very meager canals, into what was then called the Salton Sea. It was a natural impression, or depression in the land, 235 feet below sea level. So when this water came down the river, it broke the then meager canals and rushed down into the Salton Sea. It was such enormous force that for 2 years, the entire flow of the Colorado River went into the Salton Sea. Enormous volume of water. It became, of course, the biggest lake in California. Maybe the biggest, but certainly not the sweetest, as we know. In fact, it's now 6 million acre feet of water. So what happened after that, of course, was the military discovered this brand new asset. And today we're going to hear from Sid about the way they use that body of water. And it's a very interesting history, as you will know. So a little bit about Sid, if I may. Sid is a communications and education expert for over 40 years. He recently retired from the California Community College system. He's a private pilot for over 35 years. He has a very strong interest in all sorts of airplanes, particularly seaplanes. His favorite seaplane is the PBY Catalina. And his dad worked in Convair, which was the successor to Consolidated Aircraft, as you well know, the manufacturer of the PBY. And his dad was also at Pearl Harbor when the bombing took place there in September the 7th. December. He went on to become a student of Naval War History, and he grew up in the San Diego area and was intrigued by Salton Sea and its history. And so today he's going to come and tell us a little bit about that history, and I appreciate you coming, sir. Thank you very much. Come on up, Sid, please.
Can you hear me all right? Yeah, my name's Sid Burks, and I'm here to talk about the history of the military history of the Salton Sea. A lot of us worry about World War II being forgotten. In the case of the Salton Sea, most people didn't know about it in the first place. So I was kind of amazed by the information that's available, but it's scattered all over the place. And I took it on myself to try to pull it all together so that if anybody was interested in the military history of the Salton Sea, they could at least know about it. So I'll break my talk into sections. We'll talk about the early years on the North Shore, where the Navy first started at Dade Palm Beach, which later was called Desert Beach. We'll have a sequence here. We'll talk about pre-World War II aviation and the significance of the Salton Sea. Then after the early years, in 1942, a permanent facility was built at the southwest part of the Salton Sea, in an area called Sandy Beach. And then that was later upgraded in 1944 to a Naval Auxiliary Air Station. And then finally, after the war, there was a lot of Cold War history that a lot of people weren't aware of. We'll talk a little bit about. And we'll also talk about some of the development work that went on in the Salton Sea. It's really kind of fascinating once you get into it. So to understand the significance of the Salton Sea, you have to think back before World War II. Commercial aviation was all about flying boats because they were competing with the ocean liners, and anybody that could afford to fly wanted luxury. So you had flying boats, and you didn't have a lot of hard surface runways that were big enough for these flying boats. And Pan Am was charting transatlantic and trans-Pacific routes all over the world for the Clippers. And here you can see the seaplane base outside of Yorba Linda in San Francisco. Before the war, that was going to be the San Francisco airport. Of course, once the war happened, the the Navy took it over. And then after the war, there was plenty of hard surface runways around, so it could sort of change the complexion of aviation. The military, the Navy, was all involved in flying boats too. And they started off buying consolidated PBYs. Consolidated started off in upper New York and then moved to San Diego because they got tired of having to break these things down and put them on railroad trains because everything was frozen. So they moved the whole operation to San Diego. And this was the first one, the PBY, came out in 1936. By 1939, the PBY was considered obsolete, but it was so good at doing so many different things that they never took it out of production until the end of the war. This is actually a civilian PBY that was used for research, flying over San Diego. A few highlights on the PBY. It was about 4,000 of them made over 10 years. About half of them were the amphibious version. The British PBY, and there's several countries flew the PBY, but the British PBY found the German battleship the Bismarck and dogged it until the British Navy could sink it. And also the first aircraft to play a role in sinking a submarine was at Pearl Harbor, was a PBY. And of course at Midway, the PBY was the one that found the Japanese fleet, and you all know what happened at Midway. It changed the whole tide of the war. So, the military value of the Salton Sea. You can see here, San Diego Bay, Salton Sea. And when I first read this, that there was an emergency landing site, I thought, that doesn't make sense. What was the odds of a flying boat over the Salton Sea having an emergency? And then after I read into it a little bit, I understood that the emergency was not being able to land in San Diego. If the coast went under with either fog or overcast, and you've got a seaplane coming from Hawaii or maybe from Corpus Christi or somewhere in the east, and they can't get into San Diego Bay, that's an emergency. So the Salton Sea became an alternative landing spot, and there's many documented cases where seaplanes, not only PBYs but others, had to land at the Salton Sea because they couldn't get in anywhere else, and with the fuel they had. There's probably many more that were undocumented. And they also use it as a training area. You see how small San Diego Bay is compared to the Salton Sea. And San Diego Bay, before the war, was a hotbed of military activity, plus they had a large and very active fishing fleet. So all that's going on in San Diego Bay, and now you're going to try to train novice seaplane pilots how to land. So it became a training alternative. And it was also a good place to, in 1940, they installed the first bomb target, which would be one of many. So they would go out there from San Diego, practice bombing, and return back, because the Navy preferred water bombing, and there just wasn't enough targets on the coast to accommodate all the training that needed to be done. So, the first recorded history of the Salton Sea is in December of 1939. This is 2 years before Pearl Harbor. A seaplane, a PBY out of San Diego, set down in the Salton Sea, and they set out a bunch of kerosene-fired buoys to mark the landing area because they were night operations in San Diego with other PBYs. And they were afraid if the fog rolled in and they couldn't land, they'd have to come out to the Salton Sea. So that seaplane stayed there all night with those buoys going just to have an emergency landing field for PBYs. I think before the war, it was pretty much fair weather flying, and they probably didn't do a lot of night flying. And remember, these are basic VFR airplanes. So I think as the war started to gear up, they realized they weren't going to be able to choose when they wanted to fly, and they had got into more night operations. The problem was at the northwest corner, the Navy didn't have any facilities. So there was a gentleman there named Gus Tyler who had set up he was the original pioneer in the Salton Sea. And he developed a resort. He built this 200-foot pier, and he drug in some buildings that were used in the Olympic Village in 1932 in Los Angeles. And he made a little resort. And he had a contract with the Navy, so if a plane had to set down there and remain overnight, he provided the lodging and the food for the crew, and also the boat to get them back and forth from where they were moored to his establishment. Oh. His wife, I guess, was a very good cook. And I think the Navy guys started really liking to stay there and eat her food. And I think there was some mechanical problems that sort of instantly appeared when they landed there, which required them to stay over a little longer. And he would also open up his resort to soldiers from Camp Young to come down and swim for free. So they had a lot of soldiers that would come down there and probably, buy some beer or two and things like that. And including Patton, General Patton made it down there a few times. Now, not too long after the Navy started operations in the Salton Sea, barnacles started showing up in the sea. And this is a quote from an artist that lived over on the west side, and he's talking about the paradox of the Salton Sea. And then now he's wondering where these barnacles came from. Well, the best bet was that when the PBYs flushed out their bilges, there were larvae in there, and the Salton Sea was salty enough that the larvae could actually thrive in fresh water. And now you can see these are relatively recent shots, all kinds of barnacles. In fact, what passes for sand at the Salton Sea is actually a combination of barnacles and broken up fish bones. So it looks like nice white sandy beaches? No. So after they started using the Salton Sea, they decided that they needed some more permanent facilities. They needed some buoys to tie to more of the seaplanes. And the Coast Guard and the Navy, well, the Navy agreed to provide the money to buy the buoys if the Coast Guard would install them and maintain them. The problem was they couldn't agree on what kind of buoys to get and where to put them. So you got about 2 years of inter-service bickering about where these things are going to go. The Navy wanted them up on the northeast end, where they could get Mrs. Eiler's cooking. But the Coast Guard had already built a pier down on the southwest side to hold up their end of the bargain about having to maintain the buoys. This was a still that I lifted off of a film called Wake Island. We'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But eventually, after, when things, Pearl Harbor happened and things started heating up, the Coast Guard became part of the Navy, so now all that went away and they agreed to build a facility down there. So they did a bunch of studies to see if the Salton Sea was adequate to be a seaplane base. And these fellows here are sounding the sea to check the depth. I think it ended up being about 248 feet. No, I'm sorry, 50 feet. And must have been one of those 120-degree days that they recorded. You could see these guys are stripped down to their skivvies. And I think these guys over here were officers and gentlemen because they've got all their clothes on. Not sure. But anyway, the studies came back and that the Salton Sea would be a good seaplane base. And at that time, the salinity was actually a little less than the ocean. Now it's more. I think it's like 25% more. So in 1942, a permanent facility was built at the sandy beach area on the southwest side. If you're familiar with the Salton Sea, it's this side of the Border Patrol checkpoint on 86. And here's an old chart showing a seaplane base. And there's a picture of the sandy beach. It's from a postcard. And probably it was picked because the topography was better for a seaplane ramp because they had to get those things out of the water and get them back up on land. So in 1942, they spent about $1.25 million to build the station there. One of the prime contractors was Webb. You remember that name? And the pier had been built previously by the Coast Guard. They built a seaplane ramp, parking area, control tower, buildings, and they had about 150 men stationed there. And it was pretty primitive. About that same time in 1942, they made a movie, Paramount Studios made a movie there called Wake Island. And they built a 4,000-foot runway, clay, and a series of buildings, and supposedly they hired the same contractor that built the facilities on Wake Island itself. They wanted accuracy. Unfortunately, they weren't as accurate in the storyline, because in the movie, they fight to the last man, but in reality, the Navy CO surrendered to the Japanese, and the people who were left on the base were either killed outright or shipped off as slave labor. And there's a gentleman in Riverside who was a civilian contractor who wrote a book about his story there. And last time I talked to him, he was still with us. That was a couple of years ago. But his book is, you can buy it at the Air Museum. It's interesting reading. It reads a lot like Unbroken, if you've read that. This runway can still be seen today. In fact, I was flying over it about a year or so ago, and it was actually a high-wing airplane parked on it. I don't know whether it was an emergency or just some wannabe bush pilot, but he was there. And when they were done with the movie, they gave this runway to the Navy, along with the buildings. It's probably the only way that they could get the Navy to cooperate with them on this whole thing, because of the wartime security. A couple other films that were made about that same time was Sahara with Humphrey Bogart. And the interesting thing about this movie, they used GIs from Camp Young to play the German soldiers. It's kind of ironic. So the first 4 PBYs were actually the amphibious version, arrived in 1942. And I picked this picture because you can see the landing gear. This is a Coast Guard PBY. This officer's got his summer uniform on. And I can't prove that this is the Salton Sea, but I'm almost 100% sure it is. Because both the Coast Guard and the Navy use the Salton Sea for training. So the PBY, the P stood for patrol, and the value of the PBY and the seaplanes to the Navy was they could be, remember this is before radar, so they could be used to see over the horizon to see who was there without exposing the fleet. And being a seaplane, if they had to land in the water, no problem. They could also drop bombs, so that B was for bomb. The Y was for Consolidated Aircraft Company. C had already been claimed by Curtiss Aircraft. And this was the 5th version, and it was the amphibious version of the 5th version. So you have PB5s and PB5As. So the PB5 would be a flying boat, the PB5A would be amphibious. And there was one more version of the PB6A. It was built towards the end of the war, but Consolidated was so busy building these things that they couldn't take stock production to build this 6th version, so the Navy actually built it themselves in their own factory. And the 6th, the last version, was the only one that had hydraulic assist to the controls. And you could always tell a PBY driver because they had big, thick forearms hogging that thing around. Most of the PBYs at the Salton Sea were the training command. These first 4 that showed up were the transition training. So they were transitioning pilots from the old flying boats to the amphibious version. But most of the training was done in the flying boat version. And so to get these things out of the water, sailors had to go in the water with beaching gear, attach it to the aircraft, and then they'd pull it up the ramp with a tug or a tractor. If they didn't have a tug or a tractor, they could actually head it in and run it up there under its own power. And this is a drawing of a British PBY. It wouldn't be flying with the beaching gear. You can see the beaching gear attached here. That's what it looked like. In 1944, the Salton Sea went through an expansion, and they went into rocket training. And base personnel increased to 638. And they would have over 55 carrier squadrons rotate in here for rocket training over about a year, from 1944 to 1945. This is an Avenger, and it was a primary airplane that was used at the Salton Sea. This is actually at the Salton Sea. You can see the rockets under the wings. You can also see the different airplanes that were there. Here's another different type of patrol bomber. You got a DC-3 or C-47, whatever you want to call it over there. But all kinds of different aircraft at the Salton Sea. All kinds of different services. The Navy used it, the Coast Guard used it, the Marine Corps used it, the Army Air Force used it. So a lot of activity going on. And originally, they built one east-west runway, and when they got into rocket training, they built in a crosswind runway. And you can see the taxiway up here. This is a seaplane area. There's a seaplane ramp, or the seaplane parking area. There's the ramp. And this is the road into the base. And this goes up to some bunkers that are north of there. These are in addition to the Paramount runway. So they actually have 3 runways. A Paramount runway and then 2 land plane runways. Like I said, the primary The most predominant aircraft at the Salton Sea from 1944 on was the TBM Avenger. It was built by Grumman. The government wanted Grumman to concentrate on some other airplanes, so they asked it to turn over production of the Avenger to General Motors. And General Motors had a little problem with these automotive types, couldn't figure out how to put the airplane together. So Grumman sent them one that was Quicoed together. If you're familiar with Quicos, they're like temporary rivets. And so it was temporary riveted together so they could take it apart and put it back together. This was the biggest single engine fighter around. And the air crews referred to it as the turkey, as in a big turkey. It had a crew of 3, pilot, radio man, and gunner. And this is the one that George Bush the Elder was shot down in. And there's a beautiful example of this over at the Air Museum. It's also the first single engine fighter to have radar, because it was the only one that had room for it. So the types of training that was conducted at the Salton Sea over the years, seaplane landings and takeoffs, and by the way, they had a type of landing that was a new experience for a lot of the pilots. It was a glass landing. When there was no wind conditions at the sea, the surface of the water was like glass. And the problem was the pilots couldn't tell their distance from the water when it was like flat glass. And they had quite a few of them would slam down and bust a bunch of rivets and split the hull. Air-to-ground rocket attacks after 1944. Torpedo attacks, here you see an Avenger let loose a torpedo. Aerial gunnery and strafing. Formation flying, night flying, all kinds of bombing. The Navy didn't have much value for high altitude bombing, but it was in the syllabus. So the unit commanders were afraid to ignore it, so they went through the process of high altitude bombing. Also skid bombing, I'll talk about that in a second. And the Navy pilots, bombardiers, practiced with the Norden bombsight at North Island on simulators, and then they rotate out to the Salton Sea to drop on targets. And this was probably one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Second World War, but it was kind of a waste because the Germans had already bought the plans from one of Norden's employees. And they didn't think much of it, so they never did anything with it. But it was so secret that the bombardiers were issued pistols and given orders to shoot the bomb site if it should ever have an opportunity to get into enemy hands. There's a nice example of this on display over at the Air Museum also. The Norden bomb site used a mineral called calcite for its optics, and the only place it was available was about halfway between the Salton Sea and Borrego on the north side of the road there. And there was a mine, and they mined that thing 24/7, and they had a contingent of Marines guarding it. And that went on until they developed a synthetic version. And once they developed a synthetic version, they didn't need the mine. But today there's a sign with the history of where the mine is and a little bit of the history of it. This is a quote from a PBY pilot. Apparently they rotated from San Diego. So he's saying they had a good time in Palm Springs and then they had a good Christmas in San Diego. So it wasn't all work on the Salton Sea. How am I doing on time? We're good. So bombing rocket targets under administrative control, 13 water targets around the Salton Sea. And I have to think they were almost all being used at the same time, otherwise they wouldn't have built so many of them. Some of these were floating types that were anchored to the bottom, and when the wind would come up, they'd sometimes shift positions. Some of them were pile-type targets that were more or less permanent. And one was well, I'll get that in a second. They also had 10 land targets scattered all over the desert as far away as Borrego. And 5 emergency landing fields. The Navy had a policy, if you did dive bombing on a target, you have to have an emergency landing field adjacent to the target. So 5 of the 10 land targets were used for dive bombing, and they would have emergency landing fields next to them. So here's the target locations on the Salton Sea. The green area there is the perimeter of the base itself. You can see they were scattered all over. This particular one here, number 61, was interesting because it was a skip bombing target. And the Army Air Force was touting skip bombing as a way to sink ships as opposed to high altitude bombing. And so this was the only one for a long ways around, so they had a lot of people coming here just to practice skip bombing. The Navy itself didn't much believe in skid bombing. They stuck with dive bombing and glide bombing. There's one remaining target, and but I think this was built by the Atomic Energy Commission after the war, because its location doesn't line up with any of the coordinates of the military targets, and the official Navy history says that they removed all the targets from the Salton Sea. So this one still exists. It's referred to as a target by the locals, but I don't think it was a military target. It's supposed to be good fishing, or at least was good fishing around it. One of the latest and most sophisticated of the land bomb targets was out on Clark Dry Lake in Borrego. And this particular target had 2 landing strips. It had a windsock. It had a bomb target with concentric circles of whitewashed rocks. And it had 2 rake stations. And in these rake stations, there was a sailor, and he had like a 4-tined sighting instrument called a rake, where he would determine the angle to where he saw the bomb drop from the aircraft. And the 2 sailors would, in 2 different rake stations, would telephone their angles to another spotter who had a plotting board, and then he would put the 2 angles together and determine where that bomb was dropped. And then that's how they would grade the pilots for qualification for bombing. Now, there's 2 of the rake stations still exist. This was a sort of a little house with a concrete roof that was filled with rocks, and then they would hang steel plate on the sides to protect the spotter. So can you imagine you join the Navy to see the world, you end up in a box like this in the middle of the desert with people dropping bombs on you? But like I say, you can still see this today. And they used up to 100-pound bombs, but the most widely used were these little 3-pound miniature practice bombs. And they had a spotting charge up in the nose like a shotgun shell, so when they fell, they put up a puff of smoke and the spotter could see where they fell. And these things are literally all over the desert still today. I have a friend who found 10 of them in one day over in Ocotillo Wells on the runway. So they're just all over. So training at the Salton Sea was dangerous. You had low-time pilots flying in tight formations at night. You had thermals. You had all kinds of things going on. The Navy records are really sketchy, but they lost at least 24 aircraft and at least 18 people died. And some squadrons actually lost more airplanes in training than they did in combat. The most lost were the Avengers, and there was 10 of those lost. And that's because, like I said, there was 55 squadrons that rotated in there. So from 1944 to 1945, there's hundreds of these things flying around the Salton Sea. In 1999, they were looking for a man and his wife who disappeared off the radar over the Salton Sea and during Christmas. They never did find the Cherokee they were in, but they did find an Avenger at the bottom, and it still had the remains of the crew in it. So they identified the aircraft from the serial number so they could identify the crew. They removed the remains, left the aircraft in place because the minute he exposed to the air, it was going to turn to dust. So I don't know how many other airplanes are out there, but probably quite a few. I understand there's, well, they also lost 3 PBYs, and I understand there's one on its back in shallow water up on the north shores that you can still see from a helicopter. A lot of development work took place at the Salton Sea. MAD, retro rockets in 1942 by Caltech. Caltech originally started off working with the Army, but as the war progressed, they ended up being the almost exclusive technology partner with the Navy, and they did a lot of work out in the desert. They also did a lot of work on the air-to-ground rockets and JATO, 1944. All of this at the Salton Sea. And then 1944 and 1945, they started testing the ballistic performance of nuclear bombs, not the bomb itself, but how it fell through the air. And the MAD, or magnetic anomaly detection, was a device that allowed the PBY to fly over and detect disruption in the magnetic field of the Earth that would be caused by something like a submarine. And it worked pretty well. The only problem was the gear didn't indicate until you were directly over the target. So if you were to let a depth charge or a bomb go, it was going to go forward with the momentum of the airplane in an arc and miss the target. So along with the magnetic anomaly detector, they developed a retro bomb, sometimes called an anti-submarine rocket, sometimes called a vertical anti-submarine rocket. And this was basically a depth charge or a bomb with a horizontal rocket that would cancel out the forward momentum of the airplane, so the bomb or the depth charge would drop straight down. So the two of those were developed in conjunction, and a lot of that development work took place at the Salton Sea. In 1943, Caltech worked with the Navy to improve on the rocket firing technology that the British had started. And I think well, that wasn't hard to do. The British had some unusual ways of doing it. So in 1943, they started doing air-to-ground rocket development work at the Salton Sea. And what I find amazing is that a short year later, they're a full-fledged rocket training base. A year before they've been to development, now they're a base. Can you imagine what it would take to do that today? In 1944, they did some development work on jet-assisted takeoff equipment. It was actually rocket-assisted takeoff equipment, but that sounded too Buck Rogers, so they changed it to jet-assisted. And they did that on some Mariner seaplanes at Salton Sea. A little side story, a Coronado seaplane, also built by Consolidated, you can see it's a very big aircraft, made an emergency landing a few miles south of the Salton Sea. Well, they dug a 2,000-foot ditch in front of it, filled it up with water, and JADO'd that thing out of there. Yeah. So in 1944, the Army Air Force started using the Salton Sea for practice bombing and training to drop the bombs on Japan, the nuclear bombs on Japan. And there was the guy in charge was this gentleman, Colonel Paul Tibbets, later General Tibbets. And they would leave a remote base up in Utah in Wendover, fly down to the Salton Sea, drop a bomb, and then head back. And I forget how many bombing runs they made, but it was a bunch. And his outfit was called the 509th Composite Group. And their mission was to improve bombing accuracy. They started off dropping from around 30,000 feet into a circle 700 feet in diameter. And after they were done training, they had got that down to 400 feet diameter. And then they were evaluating the shapes of the bombs to find out which would be the best shape. So they were dropping inert bombs, but the shape of the bomb itself was being tested. And they would have people on the ground with cameras and telemetric equipment monitoring the bombs. And a couple of lieutenants who were doing this decided to grant themselves some R&R in Mexico one time. And Tibbets found out that they had left their equipment unattended, and he used his favorite form of punishment, which was a transfer to the Aleutians. And then what they were also doing was they were perfecting an escape maneuver, because they had to get the aircraft away from the bomb blast. And nobody knew for sure what it was going to take. But what they would do, immediately after they dropped the bomb, they put the aircraft in a steep dive at 155-degree turn to get away from the bomb blast as much as possible. So this turn was designed to get them like 12 seconds away from the bomb blast. Nobody knew if that was enough. It's all theory. Fortunately, it was. And one thing they didn't plan on doing was wiping out Calipatria, California. And what happened, there was a civilian consulting engineer on the plane, and for some reason he thought they'd passed their point where they should have dropped the bomb, and he took it on himself to drop it, to release it. And he was escorted to Salt Lake City and told never to come back. But this thing fell about a half mile from downtown Calipatria. And the funny thing is, this was such a secret operation, before anybody knew anything about it, the crater was filled in, and it's like it never happened. And considering, communications in 1944, that's pretty good. After the war, the Navy just established the Salton Sea base, but they maintained it as an emergency landing area for seaplanes. And it was actually a pretty impressive facility. They had a radio beacon, a light beacon, a boathouse, and they had a 10,000-foot landing area for seaplanes. And this actually stayed in service until the last seaplane was taken out of commission which would have been 1968 according to this program. After the war, the base was taken over by the Army Manhattan District Project, which was the people that built the bombs that were dropped on Japan, for 1 year. So for 1 year, you've got Navy personnel, you've got Army personnel, you've got civilian personnel, all three of it at the Salton Sea, which must have made for some interesting conversations. In 1947, the Atomic Energy was commissioned, and they inherited all the assets of the Manhattan Project, including the test base. So for those years, this was referred to as a test base. It was pretty much run by Sandia Corporation. Sandia Labs were the ones that started, and this was an offshoot of that. So that went from 1947 to 61, and they invested $3.5 million in the Salton Sea, which is almost $35 million by today's standards. And you can see they had quite a complex. They used telemetric and photographic equipment to study the bombs as they dropped. They had offices and shops, they had bomb targets, they had a control tower. They had housing for about 300 of the 1,000 people that were stationed there. They even bused kids to school in nearby towns. They had a facility called the San Felipe Lodge, which was a hotel, bar, restaurant, tennis courts, swimming pool, crafts rooms. It was sort of the social center of this whole thing. And of course, all the infrastructure to support that. And the missions there were to study, same thing they started doing with Colonel Tibbets, studying how those bombs fall and what were the best shapes. They performed weather-related research to the high-altitude bombing. And they sometimes, when they weren't busy, they hired out the sea to other agencies as a bombing range. And they assisted in all these different things, including the Mercury parachute, where they developed the parachute that allowed the Mercury capsule to come back to Earth. I think the Mercury capsule was dropped over 20 times into the Salton Sea in the development of that parachute. And they would photograph the bombs, and they would use the standard Hollywood Mitchell camera. But they also had these German cameras. Forgot to ask my wife how to pronounce that, but she's German. But these were actually war prizes. They were taken from Wernher von Braun's operation in Telemunda they were used in the development of the V1 and V2 rockets. And they were way superior to anything we had, because they would just compile all kinds of data on these bomb shapes as they dropped. In the 1950s, the water started rising in the Salton Sea, so they had to build a horseshoe-type levee around the base made out of concrete and clay. That levee is still there today. You can drive on it. And here's some pictures. This one was taken during the war. Here's the runways, the land plane runways, the parking area for seaplanes and so on. Now this one was taken later, after the water had risen, and you can see that the water has taken out about everything to the right of this line. And then there's the Wake Island runway right there. And you can just see what's left. The east-west runway's here, but the north-south runway's underwater. So as the water gradually recedes, we'll probably be able to see some more of the Salton Sea base. In 1961, Naval Air Facility El Centro took it over for parachute testing. And they changed the name of the organization a couple times. And in 1979, all parachute testing was transferred to China Lake. But between those years, they did parachute testing at the Salton Sea. It was a really bad movie that was made about that time called The Monster That Challenged the World. And this movie wasn't good enough to be a B movie. I think it was like a C- movie. And the storyline is that there's a massive earthquake underneath the Salton Sea. The Earth's crust splits open, and this giant sitch bug crawls out of the bowels of the Earth and tries to reproduce and multiply. And the hero, the Navy commander, is chasing him all over the Salton Sea trying to do him in. But They do have some nice shots of the Naval Air Facility in El Centro during the 50s, which they refer to as the Salton Sea, but it's not. So today, you can still see the pier, the remnants of the pier. I've never found anything that says that that pier was rebuilt at any time, so I'm assuming that that's what's left of the original Coast Guard pier. You can still see some of the infrastructure, street lights, and there's some slabs and some water pipe and so on. These were most certainly left over from the Atomic Energy Commission's upgrades, the $34 million deal. The Navy is responsible for safety in the area, and they're obligated to have a safety training program, and this is it, some metal signs. Here's the old one, this is the new one. The Navy has said that they've cleaned it to 2 feet deep, but who knows what's buried below 2 feet. The Navy also did a couple cleanups in the 80s to get all the old bomb shapes. They were all supposedly found by divers and shipped back to New Mexico. Yeah, so that's my presentation.
Oh,